A dream gives way to a memory. Lisbon, 1978. Two lovers, Francisco and Rita, join hands. It seems an uncertain gesture. We'll soon learn why, over a cafe's table. The death, the murder of Joao, their mutual friend and artistic collaborator. What follows in fragments of non-linear and disjointed time is all of Portugal. A metafictional layer cake whose events encompass the friends' staging of a play in a derelict studios, the intrigue and gossip and revolutionary plots of Portugal's youthful and often unsurprisingly po-faced intelligentsia, dinner parties, musical interludes. In the background is the aftermath of the Processo Revolucionario em Curso, a period of ongoing political instability in Portugal, marked by a failed right-wing coup d'etat, a failed left-wing coup d'etat. The play they're putting on, the play in question, which swallows some half of this big film, is based in turn on Alexander Herculano's The Jester, a mythic 19th century romance which tells the story of Portugal's founding. Knights, star-crossed lovers, war, execution, blood, normal stuff. José Álvaro Morais, The Jester, his first feature, would win the Golden Leopard. Everything is up for grabs. National identity, the process of national storytelling, everything. This is MoobTube, podcast where Owen and Ralph talk about a film they've seen on Mubi. Because of the pandemic, duh. Ralph, were you in on the Jester's joke?
Very relaxing intro there.
I'm doing ASMR now.
Yeah,
on the side.
This is
got to hustle.
What we need to feel that intimacy. I was charmed by this film. I think the viewing experience required a certain level of attention. There's two narratives going on. Even within that, there's many narratives, but you have this section of Portuguese history, which, as it occupies enough of the screen time that you can't just kind of regard it as like interludes of battle and war and love and
it's
royalty.
As important as
it's clearly
the modern day narrative,
and it's imbricated so much. A character will be speaking with a level of passion that is appropriate to the theatre, but they'll actually be talking to someone off stage about about the main narrative of the film, which is about these people who are putting on plays and also involved in the tumultuous political scenario and involved in arms dealing. I'm glad we're reviewing this film. It's probably the most obscure film we've reviewed. I was just told by my friend who I was on a walk with that she is perfectly fine listening to this podcast when we talk about films she hasn't seen.
That is a huge relief.
Yeah, it's very relieving for me.
Guess what, folks? It's a treat.
But it's on Mubi, and I'm sure it will probably, the amount of people who've seen it will probably double as a result of it being on Mubi.
I thought you were going to say as a result of this podcast.
I mean, I don't know how many. It won the Golden Leopard, but it is. Yeah, it's weird. I suppose that it's very underrepresented on the internet. It's very hard to find any content about it, or about the director himself.
English language, Portuguese. Not that either of us read Portuguese, but searching on it. But there's very little about Morais himself. I don't know if in part because obviously normally when a filmmaker makes a film about a national myth, it's treated as a national event in that country, and you expect a lot more celebrity and infamy around this film. It won a prize in 1987 when it was released, sort of 10 years after the events it depicts, which isn't obvious actually. I think it's one of the, I suppose I say problems with this film, but the knowledge you need of Portugal, Portuguese history, Portuguese current events or current, within the context of the film, contemporary events is so enormous, because you've got the political situation, which is very complicated anyway, right wing, left wing. What we're seeing here in 1978 is kind of like it's a kind of right wing backlash against the left wing, failed left wing coup. So there's police characters. There's an element of police proceduralness, which is something we always come back to. So many police procedurals everywhere. There's policemen investigating Joao, one of the characters who's smuggling weapons, but it's never really clear who he's smuggling weapons for. He was originally a member of this like left-wing revolutionary gang, isn't anymore. His motivations and loyalties are unclear. At one point he tries to sell, that's unsuccessful, he tries to sell the weapons to just straight up regular old arms dealers, and they're not interested. And they refer to actually that's the point when that deal doesn't go through. Towards the end of the film, he says, well, we, my partners and I can't go through with the order. I almost said it like John Burkell there. Order. Said it can't go through with the order because of the situation. And Joao says, I'm not aware of the situation. And then he kind of shrugs it off and leaves. And it's kind of, I don't think that's supposed to be like a metafictional thing, but it was that point where, it's very hot last night. It's very hot today. And I was kind of like, it's probably very hard to like keep track of this film. Because of the layers of knowledge and complexity, but also for stylistic and formalistic reasons. Go on, let's talk about like stylistically, formally, what are we looking at? What is this film?
We're looking at something that is very much within the European heritage of oniric cinema, dreamlike cinema, films that feel like they're partly about memory, films that involve history into trauma and personal narratives, but we're also in quite a new wave zone where we're in, it's very Godard,
the Twilight Zone.
There's a very much Twilight Zone. It's 1987, so it's a long time after the French. But around this time, when was Hélas pour moi made? That Godard
80s
film
as well. This is like the percolation. Like this is like the ripples in the pond from New Wave, and it's still, I would say dying breaths, but it's still showing the influence of the New Wave kind of like a good solid like 15 years, 16, 17 years after its proper peak. Yeah,
so I mean some of the French New Wave directors obviously went on to do more conventional things like Truffaut, and then Godard just continued to make
that shit
more and more innovative work. And I find like Hélas pour moi, which I saw on Mubi actually, when it was on Mubi a few months ago, loved that. Also found it quite I had to do some reading to kind of check in with
what it was. Though it's like very jagged and irregular, but it sustains a rhythm of that jaggedness, and it's very like
has an emotional thrust.
It's very emotional. Part of that's to do with this like non-diegetic music, this quite hyper intensified, really dramatic, melodramatic music that's playing almost constantly throughout it, even over quite subdued scenes where people are talking. Sorry, we're now talking about Hélas pour moi, but it's I think far superior film. But then that's a film where it's jaggedness and it's non-linearity, because that's one of the things. The Jester is a very non-linear film. It does kind of, all the knots are tied together at the end, but it's very non-linear, and it kind of jumps from scene to scene. You've got scenes where, because it's the stage, a play within a play, there's a lot of crossing the boundaries of that, sort of like the Francisco, who's the director. So Joao is actually the producer according. It is not clear about that in like any of the movie's description. He said later it's like he's a producer, and it's like, I just thought he was hanging around the set a lot.
He's very involved.
He's often photographing it and stuff, but Francisco is like plays the Jester, but
he's the director as well.
I think he's the director because he's there with the script. He gives them instructions. He gives them notes. He sometimes will be reading. There's like a voiceover, interestingly, in the play. There's also a voiceover in the film, which is quite a central kind of thread through it. It's quite hard to follow, but Francisco often is like backstage reading the voiceover into a microphone, but then cross onto the stage, not during a live performance of it, but during a rehearsal. But did you think at any point we were looking at a live performance of the play, or was it all rehearsal?
It all felt quite rehearsal like, I guess because it kept slipping in and out of the contemporary world, and also there was, I suppose, an apocalyptic sense that the play would never really come together and be performed.
That classic kind of the Doom production.
And I think that's why it reminds me of last year at Marienbad, another sort of another post New Wave,
a very melancholy. The register of this film is very melancholy.
So you have a sense of like, I was just thinking like, Okay, I'm going to go a bit wide here because we
Spread
may
it.
as well because because I was with a film club that I have. There's two things I want to say. There's non-linearity. There's something you said. So there's a point about Chris Marker I'm about to make. Firstly, non-linearity. It's interesting you said it's non-linear. The narrative between Francisco and his partner Rita, which begins with this kind of tumultuous breakdown and then it continues with this voiceover. The whole film refers back to this voiceover where they're reminiscing about Jean. This is
in
like
the cafe.
This is after Jean has died, and talking about all these events very much in the past tense. The other thing I wanted to say was about I was watching with a sort of Zoom film club that I've had since lockdown. This film called Grin Without a Cat by Chris Marker.
I know it, I love it.
Yeah, so for listeners who aren't aware, Grin Without a Cat is like a 3-hour anthology of quite non-didactic but very politically committed footage of various political struggles through the 20th century.
At the same time as Godard was kind of taking his political left cinema energy as well, the translation of the new wave into this political bent, from the highs of I guess the tipping point for him was Weekend, maybe, and then, but anyway, sorry, I'm interjecting.
It's more about the dreamlike energy, similar to Adam Curtis, but Adam Curtis always seems to be telling you things, whereas Grin Without a Cat is presents lots of quite moving material and sort of just lets you sit with it. And I feel like there's a point here with Jester about how our political histories are represented, and there is something really exciting. It's just because I've seen the film just once, and then I rewatched certain scenes of it and went to Wikipedia and kind of tried to join the dots between all these different moments in Portuguese history. I'm not Portuguese. I've been there a few times, but I don't know the vibe particularly well.
We don't have the ambient knowledge that, say, if we watched a film about not necessarily even English history, but about French or Italian, we'd pick up on the references a lot easier. But here we don't. But I know what you're saying about Marker, and I think there's the idea of mythology, of telling a national story, and I guess the role of kind of the intelligentsia in that is a big thing, which is big for all of these people because they were very self-conscious public intellectuals in their own way, and I think this is a political film. It's about national identity, even though that because half of the film is this quite blood and soil almost telling of Portugal's independence from Spain, from as a kind of county of Spain, as it were, Galicia, into its independent state with Alfonso I, and he's the main character in this play. It's a very saccharine play. It's very formulaic and kind of high medieval, very melodramatic. And I think you made a good point earlier when you're saying, there's times when characters in the kind of modern day, in 1978, are kind of talking in that register. They're confronting each other, but they're kind of looking through each other, and there's a very stagey performativeness to it. And that kind of flits in and out, and there's also the interruption of other narratives within it. There's a scene where Joao is showing some film footage about a friend called, is it Andrew? Andrew? There's another character.
Can't remember, but
who on this boat trip in the Greek islands or something, and he dies during this expedition, but it's unclear whether it's part of a plot, whether it's kind of test footage or screener footage for a film, or whether it's a real account of the death of a friend. So these kind of interruptions and this kind of chaotic uncertainty is pretty much like a mirror of the political instability that the political instability of the era, but also the kind of irony that it's kind of played out against this very, from the remove of 800 years, this very obvious thing. And it's kind of saying that the messiness and the complexity of history will always get boiled down to a quite simplified narrative where the outcomes seem secure, like this medieval drama, melodrama that they're staging. In reality, I'm sure it was and perhaps Portuguese people know it's better than us, will probably look at it and go, the reality was much more messy, much more complicated. Yeah, had to be because these were like warring kingdoms and claims on the throne. But here it's presented in a very linear, conventional story of honor and dishonor and a vengeance and loyalty. And no one in the film has that certainty. So all the certainty that's being spoken about on stage, about he was a great man because at least he was loyal to the Queen, and so on. In real life, people's relationships are quite messy and confused. People withhold their motives from each other. Like Rita, one of the reasons Rita and Francisco, who are lovers, one of the reasons they argue is about Joan. Mutual friends, but Rita doesn't really seem to like him that much. She doesn't like, Francisco is hiding the fact that Joan is trying to sell these weapons. She finds out but doesn't reveal it. There's a lot of messy intrigue, but that's the story that I suppose in 100 years would be the era of the 70s would again be told in a simplified, reduced manner. So we're kind of seeing like that interplay between the surety and the coherence of a historical narrative and the thick kind of gelatinous complexity of it in as it's lived and played out.
That's a brilliant way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what film was it that caused me to start talking about the Hourglass Sanatorium? It wasn't Showgirls.
Was it a Lynch film?
It was Humanité, I think.
Humanité,
No, it wasn't. It was House with Daniel. We were talking about.
Oh yeah, House. Sorry. My own narrative is fragmented and gelatinous as well.
But I was talking about how the Pacific War, the theatre of conflict in Japan and China and Korea during the Second World War has that is expressed in House, is like simplified in that moment where she remembers like what her aunt and her mother and her family went through. And tells this story, in this kind of fun, bouncy way to her friends. We have these narratives that that are quite legendary, as in like they function like legends. The stories are kind of quite simplified, and there's an amazing scene where someone where a battle is summarized, and it basically two men draw swords, and within a few seconds, Igash has very neatly planted his sword in his opponent, and that kind of tells us that this particular war
was the microcosm of this entire battle.
And then you have a different kind of microcosm, which is the interpersonal difficulties between Francisco, his partner, Joan, and Francisco's brother, and all these and the parents and the best people on set having difficulties, all these little nuanced, chaotic things. You have the making of a film, sort of like the making of a play used as a metaphor for the making of the film. This kind of chaotic political context is I imagine at that point in Portuguese history things felt very up in the air, given is that true? I mean, when was the Third Republic established? I mean,
74. So this is actually a few years after. This is a few years after that. So that's what I'm talking about. This is the embers that we're not coronavirus. These are the embers. That's an old joke from March, by the way. Do you remember that?
Reusing old material.
Yeah, I really am. But there's I think that's kind of settled, and we're seeing this kind of this beginning of this process of telling the story. And it's interesting, one thing actually kind of came to mind a little while ago actually was when I was thinking why it's an unusual play for a group of young arty intellectuals to put on in an era when
it's not countercultural.
It's not countercultural at all. There's nothing avant-garde. Actually, there's something avant-garde about the way the play is like the scenography of the play and the way it's set and the kind of the scenery and the costumes. There's like kind of some avant-garde-ness to it, but nothing like that ruptures the format of the play. It's quite comes across as watching a straight play as Shakespeare. So why are they choosing to make this film? That itself felt kind of weirdly incongruous, and I couldn't quite understand that, and it wasn't like maybe they are, themselves participating in this myth story. Is it supposed to be ironic? this play? Is that it? Is this arch irony about, you know, these young lefty-ish people? Actually, we don't know their political affiliations. We know Joie is lefty, but we can make a good assumption that they're probably not ultra conservatives.
Yeah. Well, they're young people, I suppose.
They're young people,
so.
But at the same time, they live in a big house.
Yeah.
This kind of big palatial house. So there's kind of an incongruity there for me, and I think it's kind of an interesting incongruity. And I don't know if I knew more about Portuguese history, I would understand more about what young intellectuals were doing there at the time, because you're expecting them to make this film, not make this play. But yeah, my cat is actually meowing aggressively in the background. We can edit that out. I think I was one film that I kept thinking about, I mentioned this the other day, was La Mépris.
Oh yeah.
So Godard's Contempt, and I think formally at least it shares a lot with it. In maybe a kind of transparent way. It's like, yeah, kind of like just La Mépris is better. But even shot choice, like the opening scene almost, or one of the opening scenes, has this woman running toward a man on this quay. Later we find it's Rita's film that she's in, and it's a scene from that.
Yeah, that film has a very Chris Marker quality. Maybe
it's
like the
Jeter
thing.
Style.
Like, so something that's black and white.
The black
There's
and whiteness about
the images are very, like you don't know what in the first instance, you don't know what the hell the film's about, but you just, the image of her running feels very urgent.
Yeah.
And so there's a use of texture, there's a use of trope. You go between, this is what and it happens in those Godard films that we were talking about, like Hélas and many other films he made during that era, where you have scenarios that like in Mulholland Drive, it's like you have these scenarios that are compelling in and of themselves, but then you're like, to find that emotional thread between them is a little bit more. You
need to do the work to piece it together. And I think,
which in the case of this, the work is involves then, I think it does involve an engagement with Portuguese history.
Nah, fuck that. But I mean, with La Mépris, it's like that scene in particular where she's running, we then see the filming of that scene, and we see the camera operator and the boom operator on rails, and that's in colour suddenly. And you've got this heightened music that's continuing from scene to scene. It's quite swelling melodramatic music, which is playing in disregard to the voices of people and their volumes. And it's really like that, that hyper dramatized intensity of La Mépris. And there you've got Fritz Lang shooting his film at the beginning of La Mépris, and you see the rails, you see the filming of the film, you see the screening of this film about myth. And I think again, it's this engagement with mythology as like allegorical storytelling, and we're seeing here is allegorical storytelling as well, through all these nested little narratives, like Rita's film, which touches on Portuguese colonial war, post-war colonial war, or the process of decolonization, from Portugal and its territories, which happened, after the war as well.
Never straightforward,
never easy. And then you've got obviously the nested film of the death of this friend and his boat on this island with all these naked fishermen.
Oh yes, the naked bit. Yeah. That was jolly. It
was jolly. Lots of flopping willies, basically. Yeah. That bit. You've got the photographs that Joie is always taking. There's lots of acts of capturing stuff and recording stuff and presenting and representing stuff, because Joie screens this stuff to them. Rita, they all sit down to watch Rita's film, which is quite nice. It's like the most normal part of the film, actually, when it's like, it's on telly tonight, should we sit down and watch it? And she's really nervous about it. It's like the first normal.
And we've seen the set. We've seen her choosing the set earlier on. And
the set against the background.
Loads of motifs that do make this film really watchable.
Yeah, I always feel like it's one of those films that's becoming more interesting in my mind now, because earlier, I was like, I was kind of a bit, it's just it feels like other things like La Mépris, which are better, and it's convoluted and hard to watch and hard to follow. I think those are valid criticisms, but it was his debut film.
I don't feel very excited about his other work, but I do feel excited about, just because it seems like his other work is probably a bit more conventional from the clips I've watched, or a bit less, not as much teeth. I might be wrong, but there doesn't seem to be any attention on any of those. There's barely any attention on this film, but like, yeah.
There's also no like the kind of, I don't feel, and maybe it's a bit of a crass kind of reason, but no, fuck it. I mean, I don't feel the emotional investment behind these characters. They feel very wooden and distant to me.
They do. They feel a bit. I mean, a lot of films about left-wing people
they're
quite
awful, aren't they?
Quite cold and distant because maybe
because they're fighting the revolutionary struggle.
There's that phrase,
this hardness of edge.
Instrument of a revolution. Which is like, you always feel like when you watch the third, what's it called, that Fassbinder film, the Third Generation. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen
it's
it.
Like
I've heard you talk about it before.
It's a very it's a kind of absurdist farce about left-wing terrorism that was made around the time of the Red Army faction and Ulrike Meinhof, and like it's like skeptical about like radical left movements in all the right ways, but like it's
but Antifa. It was an anti-Antifa film long before I think you're right. There's an element of like this rigidity and hardness. You must steel your will to fight the revolution and kind of close your emotions off. I mean,
we are very left wing, by the way.
We are very left wing.
We want things
this
to
is
change.
This is not like the Joe Rogan podcast.
No.
But you've also got
he's
like
left wing as well. Actually.
No, apparently, is there ever the wind blows? And the same with Weekend, actually, with Godard, because that film is literally just a literal car crash of a film, in the sense of it's hyper left-wing in terms of its obliteration and destruction of people and vehicles. It's...
Yeah, a lot of those Godard films, like Le Chinois, is like kind of brutal. I mean, but you wonder, actually, like, I don't know if, now this is a bit more general point, but I was sort of wanting to circle around to this anyway, like, with Grin Without a Cat and with the sort of work Godard was making and this film as well, you get a sense of just anything post 68, you get a sense of like a moment that wasn't, and a lot of people who, and also not just the fact that 68 didn't work out, but also the fact that the Soviet Union, people were becoming increasingly aware that the Soviet Union and China were like not not utopias. And like I feel like we're in a similar moment. We're like heading towards crises in this world, and we've just had like an election where I was making this point to some friends of mine after we watched Grin Without a Cat, and they sort of laughed at me and then started to come around to my position. Where I said, like, 1968, you have like a certain section of the population who are like all in, ready for change. Most young people and working people. 8 million people went on strike in 1968. And loads of students were protesting, and then you have an electoral process where that flame is extinguished completely.
Even if the institutions pander to it and lay claim to it, which they managed to swallow radicalism in lazy ways, and even with Joe Biden announcing that Kamala Harris is going to be his running mate, of course, because
that's where we're at, though. I mean, that's like
it's a lazy, not to denigrate Kamala Harris. She's got some good, valid, like.
No, man, she's shit.
Yeah, it's shit. Get out.
I'm just not interested in neoliberals. Like, fuck them.
No, of course, this thing, but it kind of it panders to that kind of like it's such a lazy, sort of patronizing way to pander to and to kind of dampen the flames of like a genuine radical movement with like Bernie Sanders.
That's where we're at with like Sanders and Corbyn have both been extinguished by like electoral processes. You can dispute the odds were stacked against us, etc., but like fundamentally, like the core of people who wanted change were outnumbered by a wider more complacent electoral constituency that formed like most people.
And the complacency will it trends into conservatism at the voting box, at the ballot, and that's what happens. And I know we're kind of going slightly off piece here, but we're kind of also not, because this is a film that's raking the embers of the revolutionary movement, because there's a real sense of mourning and grief kind of overhanging this film. Absolutely. Not only with the death of Joie, but Joie is the disillusioned left-wing character. He's the one who, in most terms, he's the only one who actually states his political beliefs in this film. Other people, fellow travellers, would believe they can sympathise with these views, but he is the one who's he is a kind of recalcitrant socialist. He was in this radical movement. He was importing arms to them. The failure of the revolution, it's implied, led him to kind of drift away from them, and he then dies and is murdered in a killing it seems kind of political. It seems,
but they could just be thugs. There's a bit of a confusion there.
Yeah,
or maybe that might just be my own confusion.
His hyper stylized, very beautiful stabbing at the end. Actually, talking
just
about
like the stabbing
deaths,
in the war. But
very
parallels.
Similar. Yeah, parallels mirror. That's what you get with a premium podcast. You get people observing things that are like other things that happen. But with that, it's like there's a disillusionment, there's grief. There's a pall of smoke over this, and at the very end of the film, it's kind of like we're almost walking through this breakup. Rita and Francisco, their conversation ends at the cafe. They leave, and they're walking through the kind of empty early morning streets of Lisbon, and then they're kind of meandering, and she's like, "Oh, maybe, like, will you stay in Lisbon?" It kind of gets a bit Chekhovian, obsession with Moscow. Kind of, it's like, "Will you stay in Lisbon? Will you go?" And then Francisco kind of gives up and sits down and drinks from a bottle with some sailors who a little while before were pissing them off in the cafe. And it's all very kind of like forlorn, isn't it? It's like being there at a party at like 8 a.m. and you're like, oh God, this is horrible.
Yeah, it's like staying up for polling.
Yeah, it's like that, walking out into the cold grey dawn of like the future, and the future is not glorious. And there we go, the future is not a glorious story of knights and honour and loyalty and victory. It's a story of just kind of like, which makes it maybe quite a cynical film. It makes it you crash against the rocks of life.
I wouldn't say cynical, I would say honest. And I don't mean like I don't mean that it's honest to be cynical. I just mean that like there's like a kind of, as you said earlier, like a messiness that's done justice. And I think, if I may be kind of propositional and forward looking, like I think artists like us who are distressed by the current state of things politically will have to take sideways routes to kind of mourning and documenting the failed revolution that's unfolding right now.
This is because I've been obsessed with Parajanov recently, and this is what Parajanov says, because he, in an interview in reasonably soon before he died, he's talking and says he has like a confession to the people of Armenia, and he says, the communists, and he's talking about the kind of bureaucratic Stalinist governments. Those, he's not, because he was quite radical in his own views in a lot of ways, kind of a radical nationalist in some ways. And he's talking about the graves of the past have been dug up, and the ghosts are still here. They've lost their home and are scattered. Wow. And he's like, that the public square will be built over the graves of the past, and he says these ghosts, and he's there to channel these ghosts, and that's kind of what it is. You kind of, he's kind of mourning this act of desecration, but he's also seeing it as a positive thing that he can kind of shape and transform their potential, maybe. But then he makes a joke about, well, I can't really have the ghosts in me because they'll expect me to do their tax returns, and I don't know how to do that stuff. I'm a filmmaker.
Did he say that?
Yeah.
Great sense of humor.
He's great. He's got such a sense of humor. He'd be
good on a podcast.
Yeah, Parajanov cast.
Rest in peace.
R.I.P. big man.
All right.
So final thoughts. Tell me about the Jester. Tell me about its kind of, I guess, is there something we're going to take away from this, apart from you think there might be a kind of like honest appraisal of our past, and that's it?
Yeah, I think it's good for people to watch the Jester, and I think I guess it's formally innovative enough that it stands out at this point in time. And there's actually just so much that I haven't made up my mind about with this film, just because it's at first entry quite difficult to navigate.
Yeah.
But there's some kind. The more we talk about it, and it might just be that we're really interesting people, but
Denied.
the more we talk about it, the more interesting relevances emerge from it. And I just love films that have parallels running through it. So yeah, I will probably watch it again. Hopefully it stays on Movie for longer than a month. Cause
it's on Library.
Oh, good. So
I think it's watchable. If anyone listening to this has any like juicy resources on Morais or about this film, send them to us, because we're kind of flapping in the dark, aren't we?
Yeah, but I think that's how it is, and that's how it is when you find a movie that it has, you know, a Wikipedia page that has 3 sentences. You know, like that's an important part of bringing things back into effect. I don't think there's any reason why this film should be like lower profile than like a mid-career Godard.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it has the earnestness of a first film, of the debut film. Like it feels like there's a lot of images. I got that impression there seems like be a lot of images and scenes that he'd obviously accumulated in different contexts, like graduate films or kind of early sketches and shorts that he kind of wrapped together into this bigger thing. Like that really, you mentioned earlier talking about being quite an oniric, being quite a dreamlike film, and there's that scene at the very beginning, them recounting their childhood with Jean, and there's like this dreamlike sequence with a guy dressed up as a knight, and a story about like a secret hatch and stuff. Something just occurred to me.
Go on.
There's a secret hatch in the play. There's a secret doorway in the dungeon.
Oh, in the dungeon, yeah, when he's tempted out of the dungeon by Dolce.
Yeah. And there's a couple of times that has a role, that plays a kind of thematic role. Interesting. See, the more we dig, you're right though, this is one of those films, I think it's one of those films that I found it quite excruciating to watch.
Yeah, same.
But it's kind of coming alive in my head now.
I had to really force myself to concentrate on it.
Yeah, I really.
But that's life at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, like just like I think it's worth saying that, like, about films, like some films are worth, like, not everything's going to be kind of easy to watch, and I think that's like, you get more like long delayed gratification. You get more out of something like this. We've certainly gotten,
so you can
35 minutes of chat.
So you can go and watch your TikToks. You can watch TikToks. You can watch
not in America. You can't.
Not in America. Good. You can watch your sped up yoga videos on TikTok. You can watch your dance routines, or you can watch an excruciatingly boring but actually quite interesting film about Portuguese history and national identity, with a chaser of Bella Tart.
On that note, we don't know what we're going to watch next week. We'll discuss it privately.
There's some good shit on there now, though. There's like they've put Movie Library on the TV app as well, so it's kind of like properly unrolled.
Oh, that's good.
But if again, like, people have got recommendations, then
Daniel recommended Olivia Assayas's non-fiction. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that.
Maybe we'll review that.
Maybe we will.
All right, thanks for listening, everyone.
Let's hope it rains.
Let's hope rains more. We need more rain. We need to get wet.
If you're not already.
Speaking of which, my horniness essay, I'm going to do an update of the horniness essay, I think.
What kind of update?
I had a very interesting response to it, which I'm going to absorb, and maybe make it a bit less straight male centered, if I can manage that.
Impossible,
given my subjectivity.
Anyway,
there we go. Bye bye.